Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, for those that are here in the room or for those that are online. It's a pleasure to see that so many of you are interested in the topic. We had the chance, let me just give you a bit of background of why we have this meeting. Mr. Carsten Skov, who is the chair of the OECD DAC, is in Brussels. And we thought that since we were in contact with him, we thought that would be just a fantastic opportunity to get some of his views on what is happening with development cooperation nowadays in a world where we spend much more emphasis on not only on the role of development cooperation, sometimes challenging the impact of development cooperation and whether it achieves some of the ambitions that were there, but also we're moving in the direction of development finance. My name is Sam Bilal, Associate Director at ECDP. I'm working on development finance. So I think even the fact that my colleagues have asked me to moderate this session is perhaps an indication that I think in the past we would have had some of my colleagues who are much stronger on what is ODA and all the arcanes of understanding of what is ODA. Would have been moderating this session, trying to convince me that even if I don't know all the definitions and all the specificities of ODAs, this notion of moving from development or integrating in development cooperation, development finance, the fact that it's much more at the European level, there is also, and globally, we have more global tension, geopolitical dimension is taking a much stronger role in the international relations. We have a new increasing, unfortunately, fragmentation at the international level. So what is the role for development actors in engaging in situations where either there are more conflicts and sometimes donors are rejected, or where there is also rivalries between different powers trying to influence different regions that have different models. So in that sense, we have a much more tense type of environment. And at the same time, at the European level, there is also a notion that perhaps the Europeans have felt that though they were the main providers, collectively, the EU level and EU member states, the main providers of ODA, and they perhaps do not get sufficient capital reward for political reward for all the engagements that they are providing. So that's perhaps one of the dimensions. The second dimension is also that there is a need for Europe to be, or at least a feeling for Europe perhaps to think more about its own interests and thinking about what the Chinese has discovered a long time ago, that it's possible to partner and think in a win-win type of relationship. So again, the question is the win-win type of relationship that Europe is looking with development partners, is it the same as the Chinese meaning of win-win? Obviously not, but there are at least some dimensions of how can we pursue one self-interest and at the same time that corresponds and match the interests of the partners. And there is also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2015 agenda going from billion to trillions, this notion that there's a need to mobilize much more private sector, and also what does that mean for ODA. So we have seen also for development cooperation, but more broadly, then what does it mean to stimulate investments that is aligning itself to the SDGs? And then if you have public and private investments that are aligned to the SDGs, one of the questions is then what is the difference between ODA that is supposed to do developments and investments that is SDG aligned? And do we need still, so that would be one of the questions, we still need to make a difference between development cooperation and other type of investments if they are SDG aligned or not? Why do we need to make this difference? And how is this influenced by the geopolitical dimensions? And so I had colleagues who also reflected on the much broader dimension of what does it mean in these evolving context to do development cooperation and international cooperation. So I can strongly encourage you to look at the papers of my colleague Pauline Vernon and Andrew Sharif on what's driving change in European international cooperation agenda, which is for those in the room, you can find that at least you can find the announcements on the chairs. And for those online, you can find it on website, ecpm.org, where you can find, it's a paper in two parts, one describing the evolutions, the second one making also some broader recommendations and considerations of what does it mean to think about international cooperation. So in this context, then just sorry for providing this background, but just to explain why then when Carsten said he's coming to Brussels and was willing to speak in a public event and answer some of the questions, we thought this is a fantastic opportunity globally to understand what does it mean in the context of international reforms, financial architecture reforms that are crucial, but also for the context of at the European level, what does it mean for international cooperation by the European Union. So we'll have first a few introductory remarks by Carsten Storz, and then we will have a panel that I will introduce to have some kind of discussions, and then here we can continue the discussion. Carsten, please come next to me, and very happy to listen to your insights and some of your takeaways.
So, thank you very much, and of course, very privileged to be here. I will try to take this bit out of a technical discussion and maybe to dwell more on some main political points. But just let me say, who am I and what is the background? I have been a Danish diplomat for 40 plus years, and have served as the head of the NITA, the development agency. I've been ambassador to the UN in New York, I've been ambassador to Geneva, I've been ambassador to OECD in Paris, and 1 year ago I assumed the function as chair of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, which is a full-time Paris-based job, which gives you a good insight into what actually occurs in the 32 member states of the DAC, and also how development cooperation is seen by our partners, not least in the UN system and the discussion at the UN. So if we start there, development cooperation, 200 billion, 211 billion, but roundly $200 billion a year, which is 0.2% of the global economy. So we are far from the trillions, but we are basically consistently finding in the neighborhood of $200 billion a year. That basically is an asset that we talk about here. And it's provided by advanced economies, it's aligned to the 0.7% target, and it is part of, you can say, a geopolitical landscape and promises made. So it's on one hand, it's an asset, but it's also in certain ways a liability because we cannot take it away and then not suffer to pay a price for it. So basically, it's part of the acquis in the global landscape that we are providing. Some of us, the old advanced economies dated back to 1970, are providing assistance to those that are developing poorer countries, and we have been doing that for 60 and more years. So it's something that we have. It's an asset. It's also an obligation. So that's where we start. And DAC is basically defining what is ODA. We do that very conservatively because we do know that we are also performing with all the eyes of the world on us. So we really think before changing parameters of what is to be counted as ODA and what is not, it's a really thorough process of reflection on whether this is actually the right step to take. But the last major step we took was in October last year, where we, after 8 years of negotiations, agreed on new reporting rules for private sector instruments, which I'll come back to a little bit. So basically, we define what is ODA, We keep track on what countries are doing. And we also look at the quality of what we're doing, try to improve the quality, create a peer learning community around it with a lot of networks and working groups and so on. So it is a professional community to improve the quality and the quantity of ODA. Then what we can see now is that ODA has never been higher than it was in 2022. But also that we are seeing a lot of caveats around that, in the sense that the increase in ODA over the last few years has primarily been in COVID-19 costs going back to 2021, that is vaccines. It has been very much in 22 onwards, become assistance to Ukraine. Assistance to Ukraine grew from $1 billion in 2021 to $18 billion in 2022. In-donor refugee costs, which we see, of course, is primarily European, but not only European, grew from 13 billion in 21 to 31 billion in 22. Not only, but primarily driven by millions of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. And we have seen, of course, a lot of interest also in using ODA also for climate change mitigation and adaptation, but a lot of it is also mitigation. So you can say that seen from the outside world, the ODA agenda is that it's been successful in raising more funding than ever before. But it's also very clear that a lot of that funding is getting close to home, in the sense that it is very much some of the issues that are preoccupying European audiences, where we find ODA to be used in a good and positive way to deal with it. But that also means that the year where we had the highest ODA ever, 2022, was also the year where we saw a small decrease in ODA for Africa, for sub-Saharan Africa. We saw a small decrease in ODA for LDCs. So that's part of the background that we're talking about. That within a success story of increasing ODA, there are some nuances, some balancing that takes a certain direction. And where people outside the European context, maybe interlocutors in Africa, is basically putting some question marks of what actually is happening on the ODA front. The other thing that we can see is that the ability to mobilize more ODA, and we have somehow political commitment to the 0.7 different status in different countries. In some of our countries, we have a very strong political commitment to 0.7. Others are more, let's say, it's more very high ambition level to reach at some point in time, but it's a political asset. I used to say it's intangible in the sense that it has political value and it's part of political discourse to have the 0.7% target. But it's difficult to achieve it, and it becomes more difficult due to other kinds of pressures that we see across the West, across Europe. Part of it, of course, a military build-up, which is quite necessary in light of the threats that we're looking at from Russia. So there is a growing concern across NATO members that we need to put more funding into revitalizing our defense capacities and capabilities. There's also a clear interest in reducing the inflationary pressures. We increase interest rates, we make it more expensive to borrow money, also for developing countries, because we need to keep inflation at bay and we need to rein in some of the overspending that we did during COVID-19. So a lot of budgetary pressures. We see a lot of knock-on effects on food, on energy, on fertilizing costs from the Russian aggression against Ukraine that sent shockwaves in many other aspects around in the global economy. So it's, on one hand, we can see that our potential of European countries and DAC members to increase ODA is under pressure. I still think there is a potential to do that, and I think that with the right argument, you can argue that we need to do more than we are doing. But it is also a difficult political environment to carry that argument. And at the same time, the needs are growing. So you can say you have a supply that have difficulty in growing, and you have needs that are clearly growing. In the sense that you can see that the number of extreme poor is going up, the debt servicing for a number of middle-income countries and low-income countries is increasing due to high interest rates. You can see a number of countries saying that we have a debt distress. That means that we pay more on debt servicing than we do on, for instance, on education or the health sector. So there's something that where we do have growing tension in the system. And in that context, my point here is that what we will see, I think, in the ODA discussion is a growing emphasis on finance. And we will have in front of us two major events over the next year or so, which will highlight finance. One of them is COP29 in Baku in November, where climate finance, a new target to replace $100 billion that was set in Copenhagen in 2009, but that will come up for decision, I would imagine. That somehow it has to be a new way of formulating the goal of mobilizing more climate finance for the coming years. That will be one aspect on climate, and the other one is on financial development. In June next year, 2025, we will have the fourth financial development conference in Spain that will review the Addis Ababa Action Agenda from 2015, which was basically the costing of the SDGs, and now we will have a discussion about what will it cost for the SDGs going forward towards 2030. So there will be a lot of emphasis on finance, and it's built into that context that I described of supply and demand being a little bit out of sync. So we would be looking at ODA, not to solve this problem, because ODA will not be the trillions. ODA is 1/5 of a trillion. But ODA can help mobilize the trillions, and that is the argument that we are somehow looking at. In the sense of ODA, and I'll come back to what's the purpose of it, it's very much driven by global solidarity. Of course, that has been the big driver of inventing the concept of ODA back in the 60s. It's also been a geopolitical instrument for a long time, it still is, and it's also been an instrument to drive globalization for a long time. But what we see now is somehow we can try to find the easiest way to describe what we do with ODA. We have one leg of a three-legged stool. One of them is saving lives and improving lives. The other one is so to help countries develop reforms of their institutions and their capacity of their policies. Of course, homegrown with government ownership of these reforms, but still where ODA can be helpful, building institutions, capacity, and so on. And the third one, and that's the one that I would maybe hope that our discussion here will focus on, is very much about mobilization of funding. Because the situation where we do desperately short of development finance and funds for development, the emphasis on how ODA can help develop more finance will be key. And with these two conferences coming up, that would be the main agenda. So how can we do that? And there's a number of ways. It's obvious that there's a lot of interest right now in recapitalizing the multilateral development banks. The World Bank is seeking more capital inputs to be able to gear that and extend that primarily to middle-income countries. But then there's also IDA 21 negotiations throughout the year, which will be primarily focused on the low-income countries. So a lot of interest of boosting the multilateral development banks in order for them to increase the capital outflow, so to speak, of the banks. And the other really important part of this is the private sector mobilization. As I said, we have new rules now on how you can use ODA and report ODA to that. Still untested, and there will be, I think, a lot of experimentation going on how that works. But try to use ODA to facilitate and leverage mobilize private funds for development. That means to put ODA in use in connection with guarantee schemes, maybe paying premium guarantee schemes, recapitalizing development finance institutions, create new vehicles of investment where you can combine private sector investment, for instance, pension funds wanting to invest in developing countries can combine that with ODA and create an incentive, a package, financial package that can be attractive to private pension funds to do that. So a number of countries do different things on this. There's a really fertile environment on developing instruments that can actually help mobilize. We will not, maybe not through that go to the trillions, but we will definitely go to many more billions if we can do that. The trillions will only come if we can mobilize much more domestic resources for development. And that's the other part of ODA, of course. We should not only stare at how can we mobilize more external financing from private sector into development cooperation and development goals and targets. We also need to see how can we utilize ODA to mobilize much more domestic resources. That means basically taxation systems, banking systems, and markets in countries, creating incentive to save and to invest that can build domestic capacity to increase the investment ratio. And through that, of course, also create some homegrown economic growth. So I think those are part of this discussion that we're going to have. But my main point here is that the focus is very much on this issue of mobilizing. Countries are in huge demand of more finance. We need to mobilize more, but we also need, and that would be my final point, we also need to be sure that the distribution of that mobilization is equitable between middle-income countries and low-income countries. Market terms alone would mean that the huge interest of putting private finance to use for developing countries would traditionally go to middle-income countries. And we need to be sure that if ODA is in play, and to the extent that ODA is in play, that there is a balance with low-income countries. And that we can do, for instance, those governments that do have a development finance institution are owners of a DFI, can of course also set some terms for how this DFI should work in utilizing the mobilized funds. So the potential is there, and there will be a lot of, I think in the years to come, a lot of discussion and hopefully also some more tangible outcome of that discussion in terms of actually showcasing that we can mobilize more ODA. If we succeed in mobilizing even more ODA, we will be in the fortunate position that we can then be even more. And my point here, of course, is to come back to where we started. We do need, this is also a geopolitical situation. And we need to basically create an incentivized political discussion where what we mobilize of ODA, for instance, for donor refugee transfer, we mobilize collectively also for Ukraine, is not coming at the cost of our support for. So I think my argument here will be that we are, all of us, rightfully concerned what's happening in Ukraine. We want to do what we can to put a stop to Russian aggression. That also includes development cooperation, development funds for Ukraine as a middle-income country. And this is right to, we are right to pursue this agenda. But we all, so this is basically, you can describe it, maybe a regional or maybe medium short-term agenda, but at the same time, we also obligated to maintain our focus on a long-term or global agenda, which is very much from the European context, very much about Africa, and how we can actually be sure that we can support African governments and African states in their rightful pursuance of growth and development. So we need to keep an eye on both balls here and be sure that we're actually able to politically and financially to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for broad overviews and for highlighting some of the key issues. If you allow me, just before we go to the panel, just a couple of questions. On the geopolitical dimension, you stress Ukraine. One word that you have not mentioned is China. And you know, the emerging economies now are very important also in their effort to support developments in other countries. So how do you see this combination between ODA and development? And my second question would be, I work on development finance. I spent most of the last decades, repeating the same arguments that we're going from billions to trillions and we're going to mobilize better. But all the studies are showing that we're basically failing with these targets. So perhaps if you had a couple of words on, why do we think so far, in spite of all the efforts of saying we need to mobilize more, we are not achieving, and what would be needed to go to, even not for the many trillions, at least to really show that there's a higher scale. So we're good in the narrative, but it seems less good at showing the results in practice.
That's
too easy question.
That's too easy question.
In 2 minutes.
But on China, it's very clear that we are not reliving the Cold War. We're reliving a situation where in the 60s or 70s, where developing countries, our partners, were put in a situation you either have to choose the Western way forward or the Soviet Union way forward. That is way beyond. That's history. What we see now are partner countries that are looking to all potential sources of finance and economic activity, including China. And of course, China is there. Chinese Development Corporation, in the traditional concessional terms that we talk about, is very small. But there's a lot of commercial activity from the Chinese side. Maybe slowing down now compared to when BRI was established a few years ago, but still China is an important player, and China will continue to be an important player. And our partner countries continue to want to work with China in a number of areas. That's the fact, and that's the bottom line. And what we can do is, of course, also to show that we want to work with and extend collaboration and economic engagement activity with partner countries in a way that would be attractive to them. But they will be in the driver's seat and they will make the decisions. So that for me is very clear. On the other question was on
billion trillions.
How
we don't achieve the
no,
trillions.
But the point is,
highly promising.
okay, the trillion, it's a World Bank thing. In 2015, there was a costing. We said that we were missing 2.9 trillion, $2,900 billion for the developing countries to reach the SDGs per year from 2015 until 2030. That was, and it went fairly well in the first few years. Then we got COVID-19, we got Russian aggression, we got a lot of hiccups. We had Brexit, we had a few other things in global economy and global political scene that derailed part of the positive trajectory right after a year where we had 2015, where we had the SDGs, we had the anti-cyber action again, and we had the Paris Agreement. That was a good year. Since then, not so much. And some obstacles have come our way, and we need to deal with them. The point is that these 2.9 trillion costed in 2015 is now 4 trillion if you look at the OECD UN figures this year. My point is, ODA is 5%. Total ODA is 5% of those 4,000 billion. ODA can mobilize more if we use part of ODA to do that. Right now, we use 3 or 4% of ODA to mobilize private through blended financing. That we can increase that. We can increase that without changing the basic character of ODA, and we can mobilize more through blended financing. But it'll never be trillions. The trillions will be investments, increasing the investment ratio in developing economies. That would be the one single thing. That would call for a lot of transition, a lot of reforms, a lot of changes in policies and institutions and so on. And ODA can help doing that, but ODA will be an enabler, a facilitator. The hard decisions will have to be made by the countries that will try to get the economies working better than they do now, and to take these reform measures that is necessary to create domestic incentives to actually to save and to invest and to build up an export growth economy. So I think we will need to go to the trillions, but it is not international finance that will have the only solution to that. It is far not ODA, but a combination of ODA, more private sector finance, more lending capacity of multilateral finance, more domestic reforms in our partner countries, in our friends all over the world. That may be bringing us towards the trillions, but it's not one golden opportunity, one silver bullet or something like that will do that. It'll take a lot of different measures in parallel to each other.
Great, thanks a lot. We'll get back, I'm sure, to these questions will open up. I see in the room colleagues from the EBRD, EIB, I'm sure they will be able to tell us also how to mobilize better. But for the time being, can I invite the panel members and Nancy Lorenzo to join us, Jean Salvan and Ruben Guzman to come and sit here and react themselves. And let me turn to Nancy Lorenzo, who is the Deputy Head of Division for Financing Instruments and International Cooperation at the European External Action Service. So thanks a lot for being with us. I was mentioning in my introduction the European perspective and how Europe is evolving, perhaps also in this dimension. And so, how do you see it, the role of development cooperation in this geopolitical context, and perhaps also the role of the OECD in this evolving?
Thank you. Indeed, many of the comments have already been raised by Carsten, so I will read some of the comments that you made. But you already mentioned that the context in Europe has changed a lot, and the state of political crisis that we're facing has also changed the mentality of the EU and how we approach our external action. Just to give you an anecdote, we just had the midterm review of the MFF, of the budget of the EU, and this is the first time that actually the reinforcements came to Table 6, external action. And it's not because of Ukraine, not only because of Ukraine, because of course Ukraine had a very sizable 50 billion package of loans, but this was off budget, which was a smart move. So we don't, this was created as a different instrument, but with other priorities, mostly in the neighborhood, and it's also to that in the neighborhood mentioning. But the external dimension has increased a lot. In the geopolitics of the Commission. So we have seen the multipolarity, we have other emerging powers, and all of this is creating a lot of instability with the compounding crisis, and we have more needs, more crises, and more humanitarian needs as well. So this interdependence that we saw already in the aftermath of COVID had the EU, it was already there, the idea that we have, as part of policy coherence for development, that the internal external nexus have to be reinforced. But now it's not only the internal external nexus, it's also the idea that this has to contribute to the EU competitiveness, it has to contribute with the EU overall strategic autonomy, and then we have to work on the basis of shared interests. It's very political, that's good news in terms of opportunities, because changes happen mostly when things are political, but it also has, it has created a shift in the priorities, in the way we work, and in the stakeholders with we engage. Other risks are also that some short-term approaches have been favored over long-term vision of our cooperation. And this is also the first time in this MFF that in the cooperation instrument, so the instrument, we have introduced in the midterm review the second country allocation. Before, we worked very much in the framework that you explained, in which the predictability of the aid is the basis in which we work with partner countries. Now, we're also more keen on seeing how performant they are, how they implement their cooperation, how the partnership is evolving. So we already announced the cooperation for the country for 4 years, and now these are being reviewed against a background of how the partnership are evolving and what impact are we having at country level. So trying to look for those countries that are making better use of our resources. So this has been a long evolution. It happened already in the last 35, but now we see it more strongly, the value. We had very good innovations within Europe. We had the policy first, we had the financial leverage that now is global, and the alignment with the membership. It was definitely a way of showing European unity, a way of gaining more firepower for the EU, and to contribute to having the objective of having more state and we will see in the coming years that we continue to look for more flexibility, more because we know that the situation is still quite volatile, so we will continue to look for more flexibility. We need to be more agile in responding to the crisis and the events that came up, but also to the opportunity. And in this change of paradigm, we have the global business strategy that we a bit later. And it was the response of the EU to the COVID recovery. So the idea of linking already investments to the SDGs and acquiring this leverage, mostly from parties, also lending and others. So the areas are very much linked to SDGs, between development, education, health, research, and innovation. So in that sense, very much aligned with the SDGs. And now we're reinforcing this approach. We have this 360 degree approach in which we mainstream human rights, we mainstream the reforms in the sector. So we have the package, the global gateway package and investments come with the values and the standards of the EU. Governance, for example, education, vocational education training around the sectors where we have investment, so that they're more sustainable and they yield better results for the population. So it's an opportunity to engage on tailor-made responses. They can have a lot of impact on the ground. The modalities and the toolbox has expanded. Now we can include not only financial, not only grants, also loans, but also policy actions that can have an impact. And if the partnership is performing, we can see that they can bring transformation and change. There's also risk, of course, because we have to be very careful with the sustainability, and the burden of the low-income countries now has become greater than the spending on education and health. So it's something to be very wary of, and this is why the private sector becomes even more important. Because we can not only rely on sovereign loans, we have also to mobilize the private sector. Another risk, of course, is what you mentioned already, that there are more opportunities than in lower, upper middle, lower income countries or middle income countries. So it raises the important question of how we work with countries that are fragile, which we are politically strange because of change of regimes or that are conflict affected, and how we can make sure that we address the fragility that maybe hampers the global gateway potential of this country. So first, internally, we have to instill this realization that when a country is fragile, it's not just the people that are condemned, but it's also has a huge impact on the world. So there's mass migration, there's safe havens for piracy and trafficking. We can see how this can enable also terrorist training and others, and how this affects is a global challenge. Indeed, fragility is a global challenge, and how it is being addressed now, and that this has to be addressed at country level. So a good step, and I think this is an opportunity that we're still working with the member states, is the idea that the EU, in view of all these changes of regimes, and we saw in Afghanistan, we saw in Myanmar, and in other countries in the Sahel, is taking a more pragmatic approach. So the idea is we have to be principled, but we have to remain engaged, because of this engagement too. Then we have to remain engaged in those areas where we have a common interest, in security and terrorist attacks and counterfeit or other things. Migration, of course, for the EU, but also with the local population. We have to work with local organizations, with the international organizations that are present on the ground to support basic needs. Because global gap is a big priority, and because re-engaging in a different way takes time, we may see, and this is a risk, that there's less resources for these countries initially until there's more opportunities in the horizon. So this is an opportunity that still has to materialize, and then hopefully can pave the way to the option of having more transformative investments. The World Bank, as part of this reform of the global financial architecture, will invest and will engage more in the Australian context. And we're also in partnership with them doing deep dives on specific countries in the Sahel in particular. So there will be a change in the way we're working with these countries. On global challenges, I think that, and this is my personal view, that what we're seeing is that there's an emphasis on international partnerships, so bilaterally, but there will be also a strong action at multilateral level. The MDG reform was a very good example, involving accelerated attention. This is on the top of the agenda of the developing countries, and the developing countries now, in the geopolitical context, have become a priority also for the Commission. So I think multilateral action will be more present. We are seeing already ahead of the fourth Conference on Financial Development initiatives in the UN on global tax reform, and of course the UN wanted to be more vocal about NDB reform, the SDG stimulus, so more engagement as well as multilateral. And now, this is a bit of a long introduction. If we talk about the role of the financial partnerships, you already mentioned a few figures, and this probably comes from the World Bank, but there's 450 million of untapped potential in that could be redirected to NDCs. So there's a lot of scope for opportunities. The problem is how we mitigate the risk. So I see that for the public funds, and for governments and multilateral organizations, there's a lot of space to explore innovative financing solutions, especially in climate action, and to develop partnerships. I think that the next step, because now many of them are being explored, is to develop the partnerships with the ground. And this will be key for the EU as well, and with the delegations. And it requires a change of mindset. So,
okay, great. Thanks a lot, Nati. I know it is difficult to present in 6-7 minutes what the EU is doing in this agenda. So we cannot be comprehensive, but I think you mentioned a clear sense of direction, at least, to which the EU is going to both mobilize more resources, but also changing the way with the direction to development cooperation. But we have a great chance to have Jin Salman to be with us, who is the director of Eurodat. And Eurodat has a long tradition of following these questions, both development cooperation and also development finance. And what does it mean, and what are the should do and don't do? So, Jin, are we going in the right direction? And what are the pitfalls? What are the things that are doing well and going well, and what we should really be careful about?
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much for this invitation to join this very interesting conversation. And congratulations on this excellent report. I read the first part of it, very curious to read the second part of it. We're in 2024, and the year is racing by unbelievably fast. And before we know it, we will have years in the 2030 deadline for SDG achievements. Reading the report from ECDPM took me back to my days in the end of the first decade of the millennium, 2010, where we also had a countdown, but then to the MDG deadline in 2015. And we in civil society started asking ourselves, what should come after the MDGs? should there be a new normative framework? And when I was reading the report, the same question came to my mind. Should we be talking about and thinking about a framework, a normative framework that comes after the SDGs? I was thinking, well, if we were to start those conversations, what would be kind of key factors that we have to keep in mind to be careful of if we were to start the conversation? And the report was very instructive in that regard. Obviously, first of all, we are in a multipolar world. We've heard a lot about that already. I mean, the second thing, and Carsten spoke about it, we are looking at a lot, is the role of private finance in development. And in fact, the institutionalization of private finance in development, now that we have clear agreements on counting of PSIs, private sector instruments in ODA. And a third consideration, and also has been touched upon, are these huge existential crises that we are facing today. I mean, climate, you talked about debt as well. Inequalities in general is being pushed higher and higher. So these are the three considerations. If we were to say, what would be the risks of starting to consider a post-2030 framework? These are key considerations. And that's how I kind of organize my thoughts for my intervention. So let's start with multipolarity and specifically on the EU discussion. Now, as you said, Sam, right at the start, the EU has always prided ourselves for being the biggest ODA donor. And we have the Barcelona commitments, recall way back in the first part of the millennium. Then we had 208 of the Lisbon Treaty. We are all very proud of those, as well as the various council conclusions ahead of big summits, parliamentary reports. This all provides a very, very solid normative framework that the EU has been able to fall back on to claim for itself that it is proud of this role. Unfortunately, when I read the ECDPM report, it was a cold shower. We are in a multipolar world. And in such a world particularly, we could actually use EU in its initial kind of place of pride that ups the ante and creates a race to the top, rather than what we are seeing right now, which is a race to the bottom. Because what it looks like is that the EU has given up its pride of place. And for us, seeing the evolution of the conversation, what it looks like is that it has given up its moral authority to claim that it has a superior offer to its development partners. Because, I mean, one thing to consider is the EU's track record. And if we have to look at, for instance, the Paris agenda on aid effectiveness, on harmonization, on untitled aid, the EU is not doing such a great job. And unfortunately, the world that we are in today, a multipolar world, a race for critical raw materials on the one hand, and an increasing conversation about the role of private finance in development on the other hand. What we are seeing, and the question is, does the EU have the political will at this point of time to regain its standing as this proud champion of effective and qualitative ODA right now? I'll keep it there, I'll come back to it. But going then to the private finance discussion. Obviously, as was already alluded to, this has not happened overnight. I would trace it back to the financial crisis in 2008. and the turnaround in the political will that we saw in the first half of that decade of the millennium. Then obviously the direct push came from the so-called modernization of aid agenda that started in the OECD around 2000, well, more or less a decade ago, around 2014. Now, there were quite a few elements in this modernization process, which all seemed intent on softening the rules of what could count as ODA, and consequently also resulted in inflating the numbers. The other part of this is that these rules implicitly incentivized certain channels through which ODA could be deployed. We've seen an increasing amount of loans over grants, and obviously that going to certain kinds of countries where those kind of investments can be made. So another aspect of the discussion that I'll come to in a moment is obviously the way that these rules were created and discussed with no real representation of development partners in this discussion and the decision making. And at the end of the game, what we have seen is scarcer ODA on the ground actually going to development purposes. And unfortunately, on the side of civil society, going out there into the world and speaking to our constituencies to defend ODA, it has resulted in a very, very cynical view of what ODA is, a view that ODA is becoming instrumentalized for interests rather than the original view of solidarity. So this again raises the question, how do we go back to those original messages and the original spirit of ODA? How do I go back and defend the quality and the overall superior value, as you said it, Carsten, of ODA? So this brings me back full circle to what I originally was starting with. Is it feasible right now? Is it even politically sensible to start talking about a post-23 framework and about the fact that we are at this 5-year deadline, or almost at the 5-year deadline for the SDGs? And what is the alternative? Are we simply going to abandon any kind of global compact on development from now on? In a world of increasing climate change, in a world where we have a debt crisis, where you rightly said that countries are spending much more servicing their debt than in any kind of public services, can we afford to abandon this kind of a global compact? Is the question. Unfortunately, the current discourse, and again, I'm alluding to the report, it seems like we are heading in that direction. We are heading in a direction the EU, and not only the EU, other countries, powerful countries, are closing in on themselves. There is a race to the bottom as far as competition is concerned to ensure that their economies are resilient and shored up enough to be able to withstand climate change. But the question is, what about the laggards? Where will they stand in that whole equation? And so, I mean, I think to a certain extent, we are all like-minded in this room. And the question then that we should ask ourselves is, how can we turn this around? How can we turn this tide? Is there still energy among us? And what is the role of the OECD DAC to keep the EU and other DAC donors on track? as well as address some of its own challenges with regard to transparency, with regard to participation, with regard to maintenance of higher standards. And coming back to the governance issue, I think one particular issue that we keep pointing out, and we are sometimes, I know it, a splinter in the side, is the issue of political and decision-making at the global level, which needs, and we keep on insisting on this, it needs to enjoy a much more complete representation of all the actors involved, not only in delivering, but also using and implementing and monitoring development cooperation. We need more stringent rules to be able to ensure that development cooperation is delivering and be clear what development cooperation cannot do. We also need to ensure that we have stronger leverage needs to ensure that we are meeting long-term commitments and not, as well as short-term needs. And that is something I recognize in a perma crisis. That was a very interesting term that I picked up from the report. In a perma crisis, we will always have short-term needs. And these needs are going to become much, much more acute as we hit various tipping points in climate change, for instance. One idea that has come up is whether we should set clear targets for country programmable aid, in addition to total ODA, to ensure that we will have at least clear targets for long-term spending in countries beyond the short-term exigencies. And finally, the elephant in the room is obviously the inflation of ODA. Carsten, you mentioned that. I mean, we've seen the scandalous increase around kind of increasing ODA with excess vaccine donation counting, as well as now in donor refugee costs. I mean, I agree, it cannot be a zero-sum game. It cannot be, especially after all that I pointed out, we cannot have, in all good conscience, have to choose between people fleeing war and people struggling to be able to have a good life because of the lack of finance in adequate public services. So let's not have to make those choices. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jean, for perhaps a bit depressing, but realistic and also longer perspective dimension of where we're going. So let me turn to Dure Boesman, who is the head of EU International Cooperation, Trade and External Policy at the Dutch Permanent Representation here in Brussels. And we're turning to the Netherlands, because quite a lot of people right now in Brussels are looking in The Hague, in the direction of The Hague, to say, well, if we talk about mobilization, how to have the private sector being engaged, how to combine different sets of instruments from development finance to more traditional development cooperation to directly private sector investments, then you have a lot of different tools to do that. So you are sitting exactly, I mean, both, you know, you're in The Hague and Brussels, so you can make that connection. And perhaps if in your comments you could also react to what was perhaps some of the challenges that Jean has also identified. Are you giving up on the ODA principles and values because you are engaging in that direction?
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm Douwe Boesman. I'm based here indeed in Brussels at OPERMRAP, working on the EU development aid. I should be sitting in CODEV right now, but I thought I will share my company with you this afternoon. Yeah, thanks. So maybe just to put it in a bit of context, the Netherlands changed the development policy over a decade ago, started combining aid and trade, and now we're in aid, trade, and investment. I'll come to that. And it was a bit of a shock to the system when inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands is already integrated. So you have development and foreign affairs in one, which is has its own merits and also challenges. And then our colleagues from Ministry of Economy came in dealing with trade promotion. So they're now fully integrated for over a decade. inside the same house. So you have some of these challenges in-house, and it also creates opportunities. And maybe just, linking at what the previous speakers were saying, what Carsten was mentioning, the challenges in this world are not going to be solved by ODA alone. As you said, it's a few percent of what's currently on the table. And realistically, even though we'd like to have worldwide solidarity, but I've learned, and we will all be earning 12,000 euros a year, dollars a year. So that's a challenge, especially in this part of the world. So realistically, that number is not going to go up, especially in this year of elections. We'll be happy if it stays that way. But how do we get then to solve these challenges, looking forward instead of looking back? So one thing that we've been trying to do is to link these different worlds. They're not just different concepts, but also different people and different instruments and paradigms. So how can we link these issues? And then ODA is, Carsten also mentioned, is a catalyzer. It could be used. It shouldn't be replacing other policies. Like, we shouldn't just start subsidizing companies to do things that they would be doing anyway. But we should use some of the ODA to start pushing some actors into directions that they otherwise wouldn't go. I think that's a role that the state has, and a justification also to use ODA in order to leverage this money. So how to do this? It's easy said than done. So we've been experimenting with this for a long time. We have a big DFI as well. As you know, FMO is a large bilateral DFI. But we have some bigger ones even in the room here on the European level. They've been around for a while, but what we've been trying to do is to link, so aid and trade, so to also use our private sector to go abroad, but also to use finance. And I think that's more the discussion today than aid and trade. It's more aid, trade, and investment and finance in a way what we need. Because what we need are numbers that you'll never get to by ODA budgets or from respectable NGOs or etc. That's even foundations. We won't get that. So to give you a couple of examples, the ILX fund in Amsterdam is an SDG fund that was kickstarted by the Dutch government together with a couple of other European countries. And with a small ODA contribution, now there's $1 billion in it from Dutch pension funds. Those of you who are Dutch, we're blessed with one of the most replenished pension funds in the world. And we started to basically attract some of those funds also to the SDG goals. There's $1 billion in it. There's a couple of more of these kind of initiatives around on climate change, on green hydrogen, etc. And yes, we use some ODA money to kickstart this, not just to fill the $1 billion, because our overall ODA budget per year is, let's say, roughly 5 billion. So we're not going to completely use all of that. Another institution that we've set up that is of interest here in Brussels, when you talk about the combination of DFIs and ECA, so these are the export credit agencies and the DFIs, is Invest International. So basically it sits right in between. It's majority owned by Ministry of Finance and minority owned by FMO, so the Development Bank. And they basically can fund companies to go abroad with a mix of loans and grants, and they can also directly finance partner country governments. So there you have the local ownership, for example, in infrastructure projects, can combine it with loans, and you put Dutch or European private sector at the forefront. So this kind of combination of activities, and where also, for example, the Export Credit Agency is involved, so they can also insure part of this. So they also access non-ODA funds. And we're also enlarging the mandate of the Dutch ECA, so Tradius, Dutch States Business, in order, for example, things that we're looking at in line with the Global Gateway thinking, but to be honest, we already started a little bit before with the thinking, but this is, it's great, is also to look, because traditionally export credit agencies are finance ensuring export of goods, services. We're also looking if they could maybe take some of the risk away for the import, so you can create investments in countries that have a too high risk rate, LIBOR plus double digits. So normally a private sector company would not go there. So the ECA would actually go, but they need an offtake agreement. So for example, the import of green hydrogen from a certain country in Africa, North Africa or Southern Africa, if they could get involved, then we can close that circle. And then you can actually materialize an investment in a country that otherwise would have not happened. Then you have the grants also from us or the EU side or others to have the capacity building element in there, and also engagement of civil society and others. So it's really a package, a mix of bringing these various of finance, credit insurance, grants from traditional development, NGOs, and private sector. So to really, and local authority. Give you an example on the climate change funds on green hydrogen that's developed together, for example, with the governments of South Africa, Namibia, and Egypt. So you have local ownership as well. It's not just, here's a Dutch company and I'll give you some money and go abroad. It's really a package. And the idea, for example, of some of these climate change funds, just to come back to this in Namibia or South Africa, is you kickstart this again with a small amount. And then you go to the market and then you get the rest of the money. But the fact that the Dutch state, or the even better European institution is behind it, creates this kind of legitimacy, and then you can scale up. So this is a bit of a move away from traditional development aid. ODA has to be audible, because otherwise our friends in Paris will tell us that we've done something wrong. So the aim is always the local development. But the scale is what we're trying to set up with these different institutions, and especially the combination. And it's easier said than done. It's like a whole of government approach. But yeah, I do talk to our Minister of Finance on a quite regular basis, also in Brussels. I do talk to our private sector parties. And do we always all align? No, not always, but it's trying to bring all these actors and push them into the right direction. And now I think the next challenge is to see, can we scale this up also at a European level? The whole global gateway thinking, ESD plus, and also with the EIB and EBRD, is this the kind of, been doing this for much longer? But could we create also a European level playing field to do this? Because in the end, for the export credit agencies, we don't per se need a European one, but common rules or common understandings are always welcome. So just a few thoughts on some of the developments. And that doesn't mean at all that we are moving away from some of the traditional projects. We mentioned fragile states or other projects like that. That's a different ballgame. That will stay. We still fund NGOs worldwide on women's rights, SRHR, LGBT, etc. So it's not that you just completely shift aside, but it's one element that you try to, with some ODA indeed, and a combination of whole of government, to try to scale up. And also, some areas are not eligible for this. If you want to support LGBT networks around the world, obviously it's a completely different kind of work. So we do keep different priorities inside the ministry, but you do see a bit more emphasis on this combination of aid, trade, and investment.
Great, thanks a lot. I think we had a different perspectives from the panel, so very happy that, sometimes I've been in some panels where people just repeat, I agree with what the other one has been saying, and so at least it's nice to see how, faced with the same challenges, we enter it through different views. And of course, probably one of the objectives is to try to still find a common path. But let me open the the discussion we have. Unfortunately, not so many minutes left. So if some of you in the audience here have some questions, remarks that you want to put, let's collect some of them before we go back to the panel. Who wants to come in? Yes, please.
Yeah.
Please speak up so we're sure that we can hear.
I'm Jean-Claude Boisdin, former actor within ECDPM and a former EU official as well.
Former board member of ECDPM and former commission official.
I wanted to ask the participants if they could tell us something about the validity of the aid effectiveness principles that were agreed in Paris and Accra and Busan. Are they still valid today? And my second question is, do we feel that the trends that you mentioned, more private sector, more blending, more flexibility in programming, or more taking into account our own interest on the donor side, do we feel that these trends are compatible with the key principle on aid effectiveness, which is the ownership by the partner country? Or is this principle being challenged by the trends that you were describing? Thank you.
Thank you very much for very strong. Let me just collect some. Peter in the back, and then Claire. But Peter first.
Thank you. I'm Peter Colletti from EBRD. Thank you so much for this really rich conversation. It was very enlightening to listen to you guys all. I would not really talk a lot about ODA and MBB, and in that sense, for business model is a bit different. A personal comment on Carsten's talk about how ODA is spent. I'm living in London. I see what's happening in the UK in terms of ODA spending. It's not enough that the ODA spending is decreasing, but the majority of the costs are actually spent within the UK on migration related issues, which is really disturbing. There were a lot of topics that you guys touched upon, maybe on private sector mobilization and the role of MDBs in that context. Not to preach of what we are doing, but at the EBRD we do believe that by creating sustainable market economies and sparking economic growth, we do create jobs, and that is the best way of helping middle income countries and also NDCs to come out of poverty. And that's what we are doing by focusing on investing in the private sector. And the role of the private sector, we cannot emphasize it enough. We do it by investing and combining this investment with policy reforms and also technical assistance. So we have a horizontal approach doing that. And we do work hand in hand with other European actors. You mentioned FMO, who is one of our biggest co-financiers, but Dorothy is sitting here, EIB. EIB is actually our largest co-financing partner in many regions outside of Europe. You were also talking about innovative financing models. We discussed them a few times. EBRD is the largest investor in Ukraine, and outside of the war, we created this sharing model of 50% on EBRD's capital, 50% supported by guarantees by member states and other shareholders of EBRD, which really worked well in terms of how much you could mobilize and bring in shareholders who would otherwise would be a bit more risk averse. You mentioned ILX. We have, I think, a very innovative model with ILX. EBRD, ILX, and the European Commission signed a 300 million.
That's for the pension funds. Just reminding people.
Exactly, the pension fund deal in Samarkand, where we invest in digital inclusion, which is very innovative. We bring in the pension fund model. The European Commission is backing up with the guarantees. The EBRD is chipping in with its own capital, and by that we really mobilize. And we actually also are behind the European Union objectives, so it really harmonizes in the complicated theme.
Don't tell us all what the EBRD is doing.
I'm going to the because and whether we are giving up on that. That was at the development minister meeting beginning of February here in Brussels. A lot of development ministers are talking about whether the European Union has been naive to give money without actually conditions and strings attached. And to me, there was a shocking number of states who were calling for conditionalities. And they said, we should not do this anymore because we should at least be a bit more transactional. We should talk to this country, then we should set conditions. They should follow a certain set of values. They should be aligned in terms of vision. Even there were a lot of security angles that were mentioned. It is something that is coming. And I see even more risk in terms of not for the EBRD, maybe for other actors, maybe for the EBRD, the defense discussions and defense industry, and also the critical raw material area will start up the conversation, but also financing sources and if you impact, I think, development in the next coming years.
Thank you very much. Claire,
Yes,
just introduce yourself briefly.
well, I'm also an old former EC representative with some institutional memory. And this is with this institutional memory that I will talk. Because I think what we heard today is absolutely amazing in terms of different, as you say, narrative, and different perspectives. And we had the DAC presentation, which is the presentation of ODA as we always had, and its goal and the need for money and so on. But the fact that it is a little stuck now we are a little stuck in this old definition, and we are looking to extend ODA with private sector and so on. And then we had the Commission with this new narrative, totally, this, how we say, new paradigm shift. Very proud of this new paradigm shifts where we have totally lost the idea of what was development aid, what even we signed agreement with our former partners, ACPs and so on a total different basis, narrative. I mean, it's just amazing. Because what? Because we want to be more political, more geopolitical, and really work with all the member states. And that gives us new, supposedly, leverage to be a strong player, a stronger player in a multilateral or multipolar world. And I think it's amazing because in terms of efficiency, it was mentioning, in terms of how we deal with our real partners on the spot, how we have been dealing with them in the ownership, what it means, and in terms of including our aid in their own policy and in their own views and objectives and targets. So we are nowhere anymore, I think. But in terms of multipolarity and bigger influence of EU, it's a failure for me. And I totally agree with what has been said by the Renat. Even we may not have even the morality to pretend that. We can see that in the UN. We sign a huge agreements with all the former ACP country, Africa and so on, to have bigger influence in the multilateral world. See in UN, how will you see that? African countries and so on don't want to follow anymore. Some of them, yes, but some of them, no. So I am just very worried about where are we heading. And, I think the ECBDM study is very, very good. It's pointing where all the problems that we have. Yeah, being more political, working together with the member states, fine. With our own interest in mind, it's clear. But I mean, how can you talk that you are still doing some partnership? And I think the notion of partnership is totally lost in the EC. We use it all the time. We have a strategic partnership and so on. But see, even with Africa, where we should have launched a new Pan-African partnership where we would deal with it all and so on, we are nowhere. Since you're too young to know that, but we said that in 2006, okay? And we had a much more forward-looking and strategic partnership than you have now, where you just don't know where you stand. And Madame von der Leyen saying we need to redefine partnership. But with such a policy of our own interests, I think, every day Europe is losing its I would say its morality, its what is the word? It's legitimacy. Sorry, it's legitimacy to behave like that. We are not anymore. I mean, we want to be like China, but we are not China. But that was the global gateway is the new thing we went through. So please, I don't know, but I'm very worried. The world is going very bad, and Europe is nowhere. So, and we can see that also, unfortunately, in Gaza or even in Ukraine.
So
sorry.
No, thank you very much.
thought,
No, this is excellent because I'm just aware of the clock ticking and the fact that we have to come to a conclusion. But if I just sum up some of the questions, perhaps it seems to me that one of the questions is it good to become more transactional and to use ODA as a catalyst to do much more and to think about, other type of investments and other type of activities? Or and should we provide more conditionalities to make dependent on what the EU wants to achieve? And in doing that, if we do that, are we losing our soul and our legitimacy or the broad principles of aid effectiveness that we're having and how to reconcile? So I suggest if you want to get back to these kind of questions, each of you in the back order, do it.
Yeah, sure. I think it's also not like the pressure in our democracies on development aid is quite big. We cannot pretend if there's no pressure from political parties. Like take the Netherlands, if you see the main center-right party, which is now forming, they said they would like to reduce development aid to 0. So in order to move on, you also need to stay relevant. In order to stay relevant, you need to deliver on some of the targets. And to deliver on some of the targets, we need to increase our footprint. And unfortunately, we cannot increase ODA by 10%. So we need more leverage. So one way or the other, we need that extra leverage. And we need to link it, indeed, with our other instruments from like the financial side, economic side, diplomacy, etc. Because otherwise we stay in a small bubble, and at some point somebody will just take the bubble away. And that's also the reality. Like it's Chatham House rules, right? So that's this is not the official position, of course, but that's also the reality. Like also we can claim our own moral leadership, but it doesn't help if we say it to ourselves. Other people should say it about us. And how do we do it? Is to listen also to them. It's like, what are their interests and where do they meet our interests? And if at that point where we meet, that's where we should boost. And I feel that we should also not be afraid to say, like, these are our interests. Too long, like, we've been afraid to say what our interests are in a development world. Huh? And then at some point, people from completely different bubbles, be it defense, be it whatever, will just sweep it away. So in order to stay relevant, you need to stay connected to the other bubbles, and you need to look at your own interest and the interest of your partner countries and find like areas where you can cooperate. Example, raw materials. It's sensitive because people always say like it goes wrong, etc. Can we do it in the right way? Maybe. Let's because we need it. We should have done this 10, 15 years ago, but we definitely going to need it in the next couple of decades. As the Netherlands, we don't necessarily have a private sector that is big in this, but some other European countries do. Energy, we do. Like energy, we do have that kind of expertise. Food, we do. We could help other countries developing their food sector. And yes, we'll benefit too, because it will increase trade. And yes, Rotterdam is the main port of Europe. Yes. Is that a problem? No. So if you define a couple of those common interests with partner countries, I see potential. Is that the only thing we should be doing? Of course not. You should always invest in health, in education, etc. But by only doing this, it's also a risk.
Thanks, Lucas. Sorry, we're pressed by time, and I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to react. Jean, do you agree?
No, I don't. I want to come back to the ECDPM elders and the Commission elders in the room, and the question about development effectiveness, whether it is a valid agenda anymore. It is absolutely a valid agenda. It is the DNA of ODA that distinguishes ODA from other sources of finance that go into development. But ODA is unique in its development effectiveness principles that it comes with. It comes with a promise of ownership and alignment and harmonization. And unfortunately, that is not being guarded upon. And that is why we are in this conundrum now. And I think we have to return to that discussion about where does development effectiveness fit in. And I just say ODA is part of a larger financing for development agenda, where indeed you will have things like the role of private investment. But let's have a conversation of private investment in a broader policy and global economic governance conversation about monetary policy, about the role of multilaterals and how they create resilient national development finance architecture. I think that's the conversation we should have. So I'm not saying those kind of conversations are not important, but let's not throw out ODA. And I'd say, indeed, political discussions are difficult, but civil society has an important role to play. Unfortunately, civil society is being put into a corner, under-financed, and that is not going to help the political climate to push countries to invest more in development.
Thanks a lot, Jean, for your always very clear comments, perspectives. Nati, what's
So I would be a bit in between the two approaches. So I think that it's not so much about the approach, it's about the quality of the aid at the end of the day. I think that we cannot pretend that traditional development aid was the miracle for many.
I didn't say that, sorry.
Okay, because we have to also think
no,
about
no.
the many mistakes we did with traditional development aid, which were very much in a silo.
Don't say that.
And so I think we're operating also in a different environment where your question was very relevant. Does the EU have the stand to raise the bar again? And my answer will be no. So the idea is that we're trying to come up with a proposition that is attractive to partner countries that has our values integrated in this proposition. Of course, when we talk about effectiveness of the aid, the principles are still valid, but they can be improved in the way we implement them. And this, of course, is all new and it takes time to develop. And the problem that we have right now is that these new approaches, they're much more complex. They have larger constituencies and they deliver in a longer period. So now we're focusing on delivering on this approach and what is the tangible results. We find ourselves in a very difficult situation. What are we giving? What are the tangible results for the people of these countries? So I think the quality of the aid, the sustainability, whether it's reaching the right populations, the right countries that are more vulnerable, how do we treat vulnerability? And before COVID, African countries had economic growth better than many other regions, but they are more fragile. So all these external shocks affect them much more. So how do we deal with this from the debt perspective, from the financing perspective? So I think now the debate is much more complex and it's not about one or the other being better. ODA still has a very important role to play. It's the glue that brings everything together and it should be there where there's market failures, where there's no other solutions. But if we want to scale up, we definitely need to go for new financial approaches.
Thank you.
Europe is losing influence.
Yes, but it's not only because of ODA, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. You see, Gaston, your introductory remarks generated a lot of Can that be at the same time remain a moral compass for what should be done in development cooperation and be effective in the implementation? Or how do you react to this discussion?
Yeah, I think let me say, because I tried to sum up four things. One of them is partnerships. And of course, the notion of partnership is something we still struggle, because there is an unequal power dynamic in an ODA transaction. Somebody gives money to somebody else. It is not transactional. Had it been transactional, it would not have been ODA. If you give a country $100 million to be able to build a naval base, that is not ODA. That is a political transaction. ODA is concessional finance. It is basically, by definition, non-transactional. So a partnership is try to mitigate this notion of somebody has the money to give and also eventually to retract if something happens. And so we try to, and we're still working with it. How do we create? We talk about more equal partnership, more dialogue, stepping back as donors. But so we don't have the solutions to this. But what we do have is a clear willingness to listen more to our partners. And I picked that up from a European discussion that power structures in the world are changing. Our part of the global economy is going down. there is another sense of, the way that we have dialogue that I think will translate into the realm of ODA in a positive way. So that'll be my first thing. Then the other thing on, yes, the effectiveness agenda is still very much there. I fully agree that national ownership is a difficult thing because of politically constrained environments, this kind of autocracy that we see increasing in the world, but it's still very much there. And I think we also there need to refine the way that we work on this. It is not an alternative to government cooperation to work with only non-government actors. So we need to find that balance where we can deal with the politically constrained environments in a more mature way than we may have been doing in the past. Third point, ODA modernization. You said the right thing. It was initiated 10 years ago. The point here, of course, is I do not fear that we will see a total stampede on this. 90% of ODA is grants. We will not see, I wouldn't expect to see a huge surge in loans because we do have another instrument on PSI. I think that there will be some corrections and there will be things that maybe need to be recorrected because we will see how it works. But I don't think that the modernization of the PSI instrument is going to change in any dramatic or any significant way the composition of ODA. So that's the fourth point. I think that right now, when we talk about finance, it's because our partners talk about finance. They come to us. We may want to talk about human rights and democracy and civil society organization and agency at local level, but our partners come to us and say, we want to talk about finance because we are short of money. We need to find new sources of financing. So there will be a number of elements in that discussion. ODA is one of them. And using ODA to leverage more non-ODA funds is one of the things that where we've been basically tasked by our partners come up with something that can give us some more money. And the problem that we're talking about here, and we'll go back to what our Dutch colleague said, that basically we have a lot of funding in our part of the world. Our pension funds are sitting on a lot of money. The pension funds members actually want to engage and also in development cooperation. Danish nurses would like to see part of their pension savings put into good use in developing countries for idealistic and globalized solidarity point of view. And then they go to the finance authority that overlooks and controls pension funds. And they say to the board of the pension fund, you cannot do what you want or what your members want. You are under legal obligation to get the highest rate of return on that pension investment, or otherwise you do a criminal act. So the pension funds then say, okay, we want to do things in developing countries. So they go to Danida, say, can we find a way where we can still secure our members a reasonable rate of return on these pension investments? There will be certain risks that are higher going to African countries than going to Germany or the Netherlands. So can we make a combination of funding where there's a first loss and risk taking and the way that we leverage the return on investment? And you can basically create an instrument that will mean that X number of million of dollars will be more generated into investment, in equity investment in developing countries than if you just had done it if you could use a kind of the traditional ODA way. And these are the things that we're talking about. How can we leverage? How can we expand? How can we mobilize? And it is, as you said, it's not dramatic. It's just that we can do more than we are doing. There's a clear ask. There's a clear ask for it, and I think we need to respond to that ask. But on the dark side, coming back to that, there's a history to this, in the sense that we have a lot of metrics. We now have TOSD, Total Official Support for Sustainable Development, which is a metric that will encompass both ODA and export credits. And you have numbers of, which are metrics that actually measure the flows from one to another. The interesting thing with ODA, it is more than just a metric. It's also a political commitment. And there's no other political commitment. You can say the $100 billion on climate change was also a political commitment. which we now need to revitalize and renegotiate in Baku. But the characteristic with ODA, it is a political commitment. Even something that there's no penalty for not fulfilling it, but it is it's an intangible, it's an asset in political discussions. And I think that is the value of ODA. It's not just an ex post noting of what happened. It's an ex ante decision or discussion of what are we going to do to live up to that commitment. And that discussion can go and take many forms and shapes and go in many directions. But the value is that this discussion, it will be there. And that again is also, the political commitment is also linked to the DAC being the one that defines what is ODA. That's part of the UN resolution from 1970 that the OECD, the DAC, will be defining it. And I think that we try to do a good job in that definition. And of course, you will have to revise the definition of ODA and the criteria, reporting directives and rules as the world moves forward. And that's what we have tried to do now on PSI, to take into account that there is a need to be much sharper on our alignment with ODA and private sector funding and finance. But again, I think that we do this, conservatively, cautiously, and with respect for the notion of ODA and the original definition. And there might be criticism, and we can take that discussion. I think we should take this discussion. But I just plea that there is a collective of 32 countries that actually tries to do a good job in moving the needle a little bit on the definition in order to respond to the demands that we face on ODA. And I think that for me is why this job is worth having, basically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carsten, for your passionate description also, and very useful. Thank you all for members of the panel. For those who are interested, we have Pauline Verdon and Andrew Sharif, who are also here in the room, the author of the studies that you have mentioned. I should stress that there are two parts of the story, so if you read only one part, read the second part. And let's continue this discussion. As we see, we have quite a lot of challenges ahead, but thanks a lot, Carsten, for stimulating our reflection, and to the panel members. Thank you very much. Thank you for those who joined online. Sorry, we finished a bit late, but it was worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Good luck with everything, including the coalition. Very clear what's going on right now.
Yes, we do that. Yes, we do that.
Great.